Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, in the history of bad ideas, another bad idea, maybe, certainly a very slippery idea. I'm talking to the writer and literary scholar Ian Ellison about the idea of decadence, a term that is used to describe, to condemn, but also to celebrate. Decadence, which we are told destroys civilizations, and also can be an expression of artistic vitality. What has artistic vitality got to do with the destruction of civilization? Just what is so decadent about the idea of decadence? Ian, decadence, it's a slippery idea to pin down. I have to say I struggle with it because it can mean so many different things. So it can be a description. Ancient Rome was a decadent society, and sometimes people use it in semi-non-judgmental ways, or it can be extremely judgmental. Ancient Rome was a decadent society, and that's a very, very bad thing. But it can also be something that people embrace, celebrate. They want to be known as decadent. So it can be a description, a condemnation, a celebration. Just before we start on the history of this, is that always the same thing? So regardless in a way of which mode it's being used in, do you think it's picking out the same thing, or are these actually different things that we're talking about here?
I think it's both, and we can get into that. I do think the slipperiness of decadence, as you put it, is a feature of it rather than a problem. It's also impossible usually to talk about decadence without starting with the word itself. I think that's a really helpful place to begin. Almost everybody who writes about this starts with the etymology, and I'm going to do that as well because I think there's actually something to it, because the word kind of contains the history of the idea. So it comes from the Latin decadere, which means to fall down. Cadere is to fall, decadere to fall down. So at its simplest, it's kind of about decay or decline. And as you're kind of talking about, what's so fascinating is the way it's become so much richer, so much more varied. And when I said to a colleague the other day that I was recording a podcast about decadence, he said to me, it's the only adjective in English and probably other languages that you can use to describe a chocolate cake in the Roman Empire. And I think that's right. I can't think of any other ones. But so somehow the words come to mean luxurious refinement, but also historical collapse. And that's not an accident. I think these meanings, these aspects of it have often long been intertwined. So when we hear decadence today, we think about overindulgence. Right? We think about excessive wealth, we think about luxury, hedonism, billionaires quaffing champagne on yachts. But that's only one part of it. And historically, as you were sort of saying there with Rome, there are many other facets to it. And the broader, more historical concern is about what happens to civilizations as they become more successful and more prosperous. They're becoming more sophisticated and self-conscious. And there's a fear that refinement kind of becomes the problem, and we get too comfortable, too set in our ways, too artificial, often too urban, too kind of theatrical or performed, and then we kind of lose our way a little bit. So decadence becomes, I think, associated not only with collapse, but with this kind of luxury, refinement, and overindulgence.
We will come on to the ways in which it might or might not be a bad idea, whether it successfully or unsuccessfully picks out the thing that it's trying to capture. So we should probably start with the case of Rome. We're going to come on to one of the many complications in this story, which is the range of people, mainly but not exclusively artists, who want to embrace the label of decadent or decadence, celebrate it. But it does begin with Rome because it is in some ways the definitive case. And I think I'm right in saying this is 18th century historians looking back and identifying Rome as the pure example of a society decaying in a way that they call decadent. When they describe Rome in those terms, are they always condemning it? Is it condemnatory by definition, or is it sometimes simply a descriptive term, a historian's term of art to describe a certain kind of political decay?
I think that's a really interesting question, and it's possibly both as well. The story definitely begins with Rome. This is where this phenomenon, this pattern, if you like, that I think will be seeing in various contexts first becomes legible, if you like, in the Western tradition. And that's important to say at the outset as well, that this is a Western phenomenon, that this is very much a Western European construction. So it appears first with Rome, as you say, with historians like Gibbon looking back. And it's not to say that the Romans necessarily invent decadence, but they sort of become or are seen as the historical pattern that many later civilizations inherit. So writers like Suetonius or Tacitus give these European historians a kind of rogues gallery of decadent emperors, in particular Caligula or Nero. These are rulers that are defined by cruelty, sexual excess, often theatricality, this kind of luxury and performance, but they're not just, I think, colourful biographies. They are establishing a way of thinking about history. So personal extravagance on the part of these figures becomes a symptom of wider political decline. The corruption of the rulers becomes evidence, if you like, for a corruption of civilization. And so Rome is kind of supplying Western historians with a template, if you like.
When the historians look at ancient Rome, Suetonius, Tacitus describing this moral and political excess, but is the assumption that a decadent society doesn't realize that it's in decline and is behaving this way because it's on the way down, but it's sort of like a cartoon character pedaling off the edge of a cliff? Or are they behaving in this way because they know the end is coming and there's a sense in which after us the deluge, so let's go out with a bang?
I think it is both of those things. I think it's too much self-awareness. This is an empire that has conquered almost all of the known world, I think. I mean, I'm not a classicist, but this is my sense of it. Where else do you go after that? But you definitely get the figures of the emperors, such as, the famous idea of Nero fiddling while Rome burns, right? The figure of the emperor becomes a kind of encapsulation for society as a whole.
And is there also a sense with these, say, Gibbon, whoever it is, they are condemning? I mean, this is a morality tale of a kind. This is what happens. There is presumably also a sense in which this is a warning. The thing about decadent societies is they are a warning to future societies. But people love reading Gibbon, and part of the reason they love reading Gibbon is it's colourful, it's gory, it's garish. And of course, one of the risks of decadence is that it may be a morality tale and a warning, but it sounds like fun. At least some of it sounds like fun if you're not on the receiving end. It very much depends where you find yourself in ancient Rome as it's on the way out, how much you're going to enjoy the decadence. But do you think there's always been a feeling with decadence that even if it's meant to warn us off indulgent behavior, it almost always makes it quite attractive as well?
I think you've really hit on it there. I think when later European historians are looking back at Rome, they're not just describing an empire that fell, they're using Rome to think about the relationship between a successful society and decay, but there's also that virtue and corruption, the power and the kind of excess of that. And what's crucial there in the Roman model and in later ones, as you say, is exactly this kind of joint condemnation and fascination with it as well. You're completely drawn in by this excess at the same time. So I think there are always these two sides and other sides as well that are kind of working together.
And it feels to me that part of the fascination in the Roman case, but also in other cases, is once a society has been described as decadent, in a way, the implication is that it's doomed. Decadence is almost a death sentence. You're stuck in a cycle of decay. And because it's a death sentence, it's also license. In a way, you've got to get out of jail free card because it doesn't really matter now. You are a decadent society. Of course, there might be circumstances in which you pull yourself back from the abyss. But I think, particularly in the historical case, you know how the story ends. The story is going to end with not just the decline, but the fall. And for the people who come close to the fall, they have this amazing freedom to be as bad as they like because it almost doesn't matter. And that also feels to me part of the temptation of decadence, which is it is liberation. And it may be one of the reasons we can talk about this, why people come to embrace the idea of decadence. It's a symbol of freedom. It's the freedom of not having to worry about consequences.
I think that's right, but I think to relate this to the series you're doing about the history of bad ideas, I think that can also be one aspect of decadence that makes it a bad idea, and that's that sort of foreclosing of the future. It's kind of mistaking the mood at the time for a diagnosis, and often it's also inventing a kind of golden age that's gone before it. I think we'll see that in many different instances as well. So you end up with this kind of nostalgia, you end up with this kind of indulgence in the presence. And I think a consequence of that is not needing to think about the future or absolving yourself of having to think about the future. Or even you could say being incapable of imagining the future. And you sort of get stuck in your present society. One figure we might talk about later as well is Friedrich Nietzsche, for instance, he writes so much about decadence. He writes so many different aspects about decadence, but he often considers modern writers, modern artists, modern poets to be what he calls rückwärtsgewendete Wesen, so beings facing backwards. You're always looking back to history. You're just full of all of this historical memory, and it's making you incapable of seeing beyond where you currently are.
So it's almost as if the thing that is diagnosed as a symptom, the symptom of this decadent society, is these people seem incapable of planning for the future. They're not worried about the fact that they're squandering all the resources. They're living badly when they should be thinking about what they're going to leave behind. But having described it as a symptom, it becomes a cause in the sense that now, well, we've been told we're a decadent society. So luckily, we don't have to do the responsible thing.
And that's one reason, as I say, why I think you could consider this to be a bad idea, even though it's also a very constructive and very helpful way to look at different periods. I mean, we talk about it as being an artistic movement sometimes, and I'm not sure that's entirely right, and we'll come on to this as well, I think, but it's more like, as I was saying, a template that sort of starts with Rome and has different content, if you like, in different contexts. But it's not, I wouldn't say, to my mind at least, it's not an artistic movement like, say, Romanticism or realism or modernism or symbolism, where it's kind of periodized and in a particular geographical context usually. This is a kind of way of doing things, a particular kind of, I don't know, a structure of feeling or something, as Raymond Williams would say, that emerges in different contexts. It's a way of thinking. And often it's, as I say, well, particularly at the start with the Romans and particularly later historians looking back, it's a retrospective thing. And then that changes in the modern period.
So let's talk about how it changes. What happens to the idea of decadence in the 19th century? Nietzsche is at the end of the 19th century or near the end of the 19th century. Before we get on to Nietzsche, what happens to the idea of decadence before that? For instance, what is the point at which it's no longer this is what happened to the Romans and it starts to be this might be what's going to happen to us?
This might be happening to us now, in fact. Yeah, that's the real shift, I think. I mean, it's a bit of a cliche to talk about Paris as the capital of the 19th century, but in many ways, I think particularly when we're talking about decadence, that's completely right. I think Paris is a place of decisive transformation in this regard. So until the 19th century, decadence is retrospective. It's something that historians accuse civilizations of becoming. And as you said, there's that moral category there. What changes in Paris in modernity is decadence becoming a kind of artistic sensibility, not just a kind of retrospective category or a historical way of reading things. So we think of poets like Baudelaire, for example. He's living through Haussmann's rebuilding of Paris. So this is perhaps the first recognizably modern city. The streets are being widened. The arcades, Walter Benjamin, for instance, writes so well about they're being constructed. The crowds are multiplying. You've got newspapers, new media, and consumer culture emerging. And unlike a lot of his contemporaries, Baudelaire's not just celebrating this world, also he's not rejecting it. He's just sort of thinking about how to represent this in art or in poetry. So in The Painter of Modern Life, for instance, he is seeing modernity as something that's ephemeral, that's fugitive and contingent. He's trying to register those fleeting moments that earlier artworks ignore. And I think this produces a totally new decadent aesthetic. So his poetry is kind of like delighting in rag pickers and crowds and prostitutes and intoxication and boredom, and particularly artificiality and urban melancholy. The great emotion in Les Fleurs du Mal, the flowers of evil, is ennui. It's not just boredom, it's this spiritual exhaustion of modern life. So for Baudelaire, modernity, this kind of 19th century modern development, is demanding artifice rather than innocence. And the decadent artists start to become not just people celebrating this, but also uneasy observers of it, I think.
Because the thing there that's interesting and makes it obviously different from the Roman case is, as you say, this is something that emerges at the point where, seen from another perspective, what Paris is doing is progressing into its modern form. It's not in decline. It's not a society which has peaked and is going downhill. This is the beginning of progress towards something else. So the future, far from being foreclosed, is being written on the streets of Paris. And yet here's an artistic movement which is about living in the moment. So the future is foreclosed in that way. I think that's one aspect of it. Boredom and ennui. The thing about boredom is you can't imagine the future because you think I'm never going to get out in the next 10 minutes. That's what it means to be bored. But also celebrating the underbelly of this, the underside of it. But does it also still have that idea of decline in it? Or is it no longer about decline? It's more about, as it were, the world is marching on its merry way towards the future. And we, poets or whoever it is, are the detritus that gets left behind.
I think that's maybe one of the strangest things about decadence is that it almost never arrives. Civilizations spend years, decades, centuries thinking, being convinced that they're living at the end, and yet those moments repeatedly become periods, usually of quite extraordinary artistic invention and transformation. So decadence might not be the opposite of creativity, that sort of boredom that we're talking about, but almost one of the conditions for it. The societies most worried that they've exhausted themselves often produce rich forms of new culture.
And is it also about hubris in this 19th century version of it? So here's a city that's reinventing itself. The streets are being widened, the buildings are getting bigger, technology is on the march, commerce is on the march. This is a society that's lost control of itself, or this is a society that believes it's in control of what comes next and it's not? Is it trying to call out for those people who are viewing it from the artistic perspective, not historians looking back, but living in the moment? Is it trying to call out a sort of loss of control? Because I'm trying to get it. I find it actually quite difficult with this concept to get the connection between the modern version and the look at the ancient Romans. I get if you say the British Empire became decadent at a certain point at the end of the 19th century because look, there is excess or there is irresponsibility. But this is not that. This is modernity, progress, technical advance, themselves as symptoms of something that gets to be called decadence. That's the bit that I find hard to connect up.
I think this is where actually Nietzsche can be really helpful because it is a question of whether you're looking forward and you're looking back, or you're doing both. That's, I think, the crux of it. So one thing that's usually, I would say, almost always true for a civilization that's, forward-looking and modern and so on, all of these developments, is that it's also looking back. And what you have, this is what Nietzsche would talk about, an almost oppressive amount of inheritance. So when you're modern and you're new, you're at the cutting edge, but there are other ways of looking at it as if you're kind of the oldest, right? You're at the very, very end of things. We look back to the Romans and they're young, they're youthful. They are the sort of the young age of the world, and we modern period, we're exhausted. And that's where that kind of exhaustion comes in. So these civilizations experiencing modernity also, I think, often have, and this would definitely be to speak with Nietzsche here, that an overwhelming sense of its own past. This is exactly what he's getting at on the uses and disadvantages of history. He's talking about not that people know too little history and are just looking towards the future, but that they know too much, that modern people are like walking encyclopedias. They've got so much accumulated knowledge. And that's also then something that contributes to the exhaustion. And that can connect also to the artistic and the literary. For example, if we think about Flaubert's early novel Salammbô, it's almost intoxicated by historical research. It's full of archaeological detail and exotic reconstruction. And yet the novel kind of, in doing that, undermines the possibility of recovering this ancient world. And so it becomes a bit more like spectacle rather than actual access to it. And it's an accumulation of details.
So is the idea almost that we become the spectators of our own lives? There's a passivity to this version of modernity. On the one hand, this progress is happening almost regardless of us. And on the other hand, what we are the people who are on the edges of the thing itself. We are bystanders, we are spectators, we are not fully living participants. That's one of the symptoms of decadence, that it's experienced in a way, like you say, as, and this could be historians too, and it's part of the fun of decadence, which is you're basically watching something that is wild, but you're not actually yourself living a particularly wild existence.
No, and you're kind of experiencing things from the inside in that sense, and you're maybe not feeling propelled into the future, but kind of suffocated or surrounded by the past. So, what have you got left to do? And maybe that's where we can look to artists like Baudelaire or, later Decadence in London and later in Germany as well, where writers, artists, thinkers don't necessarily overcome the condition that they're seeing and they're diagnosing, but they do transform it in literature and in art. And so even though you're seeing yourself as being at the end of things and exhausted, and usually also coming after all of the great artists, everyone before was much better than we are now. And this is not a new thing. I mean, we talk about this now in the age of like film remakes and that sort of thing, but like this is not new. Almost every era looks back and says what was before was so much better than the sort of paltry products, often products nowadays, right, that we've got now. But if you look for it, you can also see not that this is the end of creativity, but often the fertile conditions for doing something new. And that's the thing, another way of seeing this as a bad idea is that I'm not so sure we're good at seeing that. We're better at seeing the ending or looking for the ending.
Before we leave Nietzsche, if that's Nietzsche's diagnosis, what does he think is the way to be liberated from it? The weight of the past, the sense in which we are not living as we might because we're being dragged down. Is Nietzsche straightforwardly one of those people who says decadence is a bad thing or not?
He doesn't say anything straightforward about decadence, but it's definitely a problem that concerns him. I think self-consciousness of it for him might be a way out, but it's still within decadence that self-consciousness is part of it.
Let's talk about someone who is often identified with the label. So, as you said, decadence is not an artistic movement in the way that modernism is. And I don't think there is an ism that comes out of it, decadism, decadencism. I don't even know how it would go. But Oscar Wilde is someone who is often identified as a leading example of a way of doing both art and literature which gets the label decadent attached to it. Is Wilde a good example of this?
Yes, I think so. And this is all bound up with ideas about life becoming art and art becoming life. So there's definitely a movement from Paris to London. In Paris, decadence is this literary response to modernity, as we've talked about. In London, it sort of transforms into social performance. The intellectual foundation there is Walter Pater, who famously talks about art for art's sake and gives a whole generation of writers and artists this idea of treating beauty as an end in itself. And I think you're right. I think Wilde takes this further than anyone, maybe. In the picture of Dorian Gray as well, for instance, beauty and corruption are inseparable. Dorian Gray never ages. The hidden portrait absorbs all of his moral stains. And that's one of the great decadent images because it turns external beauty into a mask behind which corruption accumulates unseen. And so you can see parallels with society there as well. I mean, the novel also moves between fashionable Mayfair and the criminal underworld of the East End. So there's a suggestion all the way through it that civilization and vice are not opposites but neighbors, in fact. And all around Wilde, you have this quite intense visual culture gathering as well. Listeners might know Aubrey Beardsley's illustrations, these sort of sinuous black and white, very erotic, very ambiguous, ornamental excess that totally reject Victorian naturalism, totally against Ruskin talking about art being moral and So serving a moral and social purpose, this is art for art's sake, it becomes social performance. And I think that there's also an extent to which that decorative surface, artificial mask side of things becomes psychologically charged. So the point is not just, say, imitating nature, but it's sort of improving on it, enhancing it through artifice. And for Wilde, this is part of the whole aesthetic. His dress, his wit, the mannerisms, the public persona are artistic creations. And I think that's one of the things that's most striking about that period in London in particular, that life is increasingly becoming a work of art.
This is part of the slipperiness of the term because, on the one hand, as you've just described, Oscar Wilde embodies it, he lives it, he is diagnosing it. So he is one of the people who is saying, look, behind the veneer of this society, there is this other thing going on. These things have to coexist. And for his critics, he is the symptom of an increasingly decadent society because for his critics, he reminds them in a way of the decline and fall of ancient Rome. Look, here is this man parading around London, leading a life of sexual transgression, sexual excess. This man is not just amoral, he is immoral, he is a corrupter of youth. He's living like a sick Roman emperor in the middle of late 19th century London. How can Wilde both be the person who identifies this society as decadent and for his critics be the reason this society is decadent?
As we've been saying, decadence isn't a single movement or a belief. I think it's a way that cultures and societies talk about themselves when they feel overloaded. And as you're saying, in that sort of late 19th century into the very early 20th century, this word is being used everywhere. It's in literature, it's in medicine, it's in politics, it's in philosophy. And it's because, as you say, it can mean so many different things all at once. It's signaling moral decline. It's also signaling aesthetic refinement. Sometimes it's nervous illness, sometimes it's historical exhaustion. And what unites those things, I think, is a shared feeling that the standards that we've inherited no longer work, but we don't have anything convincing to replace them. And that's what decadence is doing, in that it's naming the gap, if you like. It's a diagnosis, but it's also a style. So people, as you say, condemn decadence, even while artists deliberately exaggerate it. And that's that double movement of critique and performance at the same time. And that's why I think it spreads and keeps reappearing long after the fin de siècle as well.
So it's almost as though there are some people who aren't just comfortable, but actually choose to live in the gap. And the majority, I think it is fair to say the majority, because these are always going to be slightly transgressive minority movements, the majority are deeply uncomfortable about the people who are exposing or revealing the gap. And these two things will coexist.
Absolutely, at that time. And I think it's really worth saying as well that at this time that we're talking about, this is the preserve of a very small artistic avant-garde. But as we get into the 20th century, it changes again, and it does start to become more embedded in society, more embedded in bourgeois society as well.
One of the reasons in the Roman case that decadence could be identified with some confidence is not just the weight of the past, but the knowledge that comes from being a long way beyond this, that the fall is coming. And the fall is the thing that confirms it. Look at these people, they're behaving in this way, and then they do fall off the precipice. In the late 19th, early 20th century case, there is one way in which you can argue that, which is that the thing that's coming is the First World War, that all of these movements precede the catastrophe, the calamity of the century, the thing that actually created the world that we live in now. And with hindsight, in that slightly disapproving way, it does look a little decadent to be fopping about the place and writing this kind of poetry or producing these kinds of plays when we know what is coming. But the more acute version of that is Weimar. I think the Weimar case is the one where it really is more like the Roman case, which is what we are going to be looking at when we can see it with hindsight, is a society in which this kind of behavior comes before the fall. So do you think Weimar is actually when we get closest to a version of that earlier account of decadence being the thing that comes before the thing falls apart?
Yes, I think so, but I don't think it's an isolated phenomenon. I think we need to talk about Vienna as well as Weimar. So in Vienna, decadence goes somewhere new, and instead of being a small literary or artistic coterie, it gets embedded in bourgeois society. Maybe the best example of this that listeners might know is an artist like Gustav Klimt, whose paintings seem to dissolve any distinction between portraiture or the human body and ornament. So it's got gold leaf, decorative surfaces, erotic symbolisms. So you think of like the woman in gold, for instance. And this becomes mainstream in Vienna. It's also the period, it's also the place where Freud is discovering something comparable beneath the surface of the mind. This is the emergence of psychoanalysis. So modern civilization, Freud is suggesting, is producing this repression and this conflict, these neuroses. So Vienna is a place where decadence moves inward, and it's all to do with hidden desires and hidden identities and unconscious life. But when we get to Weimar, if Vienna's internalizing this decadence, then Berlin is socializing it. It's performing it. I think Weimar Berlin does represent the moment where decadence ceases to be a kind of elite literary artistic pose and it becomes a mass phenomenon. The nightclubs, the cabaret, new sexual identities, experimental theatre, radical politics are all existing in a city, coexisting in a city, where the inhabitants increasingly behave as though established social norms have lost their authority. So it is that recurrent feature that the inherited ideals no longer work. It's just in a different, more emotionally charged context, I think, in Berlin. So you don't have the elegant melancholy of Vienna. You've got this energetic, improvisatory, almost reckless society. The First World War has shattered many old certainties, and the city's kind of suspended between extraordinary cultural freedom and impending political catastrophe. And that tension is exactly what works like cabaret capture, that decadence is not just about luxury and refinement and indulgence. It's becoming the exhilaration and the anxiety. It's both of them at the same time, of living in a society where it feels like all of the rules are dissolving.
In the Vienna case, we know with hindsight that it is a version of the Roman story because it's right at the end of the empire. It's the end of the Habsburg Empire, an empire that had endured for a long time. And with hindsight, but I think probably not at the time, because I don't think anyone in 1913 knew that by 1918 this empire would be over. It happened very, very quickly. But with hindsight, you could say that late 19th, early 20th century decadence within the empire is one of the symptoms of its impending dissolution. But I think in the case of Weimar, it is possible to say, as you've just suggested, that the people who are behaving in this way do have a sense that something terrible is coming. And some of this license, some of this freedom to experiment is because there is a widespread feeling within that society that a loss of control is its new default. And the forces that are coming are not forces that can be contained. To connect it back to what we were saying at the beginning, there is something about decadence. And one of the things that makes it so attractive is the idea that we can do this because we don't have to be responsible, because responsibility has been stripped away from us. And to live in 1920s Berlin was to live in a society where the forces that are going to shape the future are no longer subject to anyone's control. So we might as well go down swinging or partying or having an orgy or opening a nightclub or whatever it is. There is freedom in it, right? There's freedom knowing you're right at the edge of the abyss. This is not hopeful, politically progressive thinking. This is end of times thinking.
It is, and as I said earlier, it's one thing to notice that you're living at the end of things, but I think decadent societies or that sort of decadent outlook is less good at seeing what comes next, and that's what you've just been alluding to. But isn't there also, I think you could say, something quite self-indulgent about decadence intellectually, maybe, but also socially. I think it's one of the really striking things with almost every decadent diagnosis that it explains cultural symptoms, but it leaves those underlying structures unexamined. So I think there is something decadent potentially about the very idea of decadence itself. And one of those things that's truly decadent about decadence is that it mistakes interpretation for action, that it mistakes noticing the situation for doing something about it. So this is a tradition in all these different contexts that repeatedly exhibits the characteristics that it claims to diagnose, as we've been talking about. It's intensely self-conscious, but maybe the bad idea isn't that civilizations are becoming decadent. It's the belief that recognizing decadence is a sufficient response.
Cabaret is so interesting because to see Cabaret now, I saw the recent London production when Eddie Redmayne was in it. Very gripping, enjoyable, and moving. And the moving aspect of it is it seems very poignant to lead a nightclub life when we know, and indeed by implication they know, what's coming next. It doesn't engender the feeling of wanting to scream at these people, for God's sake, get out of the nightclub, get on the streets and do something about it. It's fatalistic. There's a fatalism to it. And the fatalism is what gives it the poignancy. And it's profoundly moving. There's something profoundly moving. And it feels heroic. You look at these people and you think, you go for it. You take all your clothes off because there are Nazis on the streets outside, rather than, no, don't take all your clothes off, arm yourselves and go out on the streets and try and do something about it. It does encourage in the audience a feeling that we're going to feel heightened emotion precisely because we're going to believe there was nothing anyone could do about this. So let's celebrate these people who were at least taking their clothes off. So another way then this story goes, and it connects to Weimar, is that in Hollywood, say, a version, maybe a tamer version of decadence becomes a mass consumer product. Because that's one of the things that can happen to this very appealing way of thinking about the world, which is that you can sell it. So do you think the story then moves in a way to the United States of America? It maybe moves to Hollywood, and we go from something which was a niche elite movement, say in Vienna, to something which is more popular than that and more public than that, but still, I would say, a minority pursuit, to something that becomes, drawing in part on Weimar culture, becomes a mass consumer product.
I think that's right. I think we go from this rarefied fin de siècle to socialized extravagance and, as you say, tragedy in Weimar Berlin, to something connected but very different in Hollywood in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. Several scholars talk about there being a decline in decadence, interestingly, a decline in decadence in the early 20th century, but I think it's more of a transformation and a relocation. If you look at Hollywood in the 1930s and the 40s and on into the 50s, you find lots, if you look for them, of the same images and emotional structures or structures of feeling, as I was saying earlier, that reappear. If you think, for example, classic example, Sunset Boulevard, on one level, it's a film about the decline of silent cinema. So you have Norma Desmond, played amazingly by Gloria Swanson. You used to be big, she's told. I am big, she says. It's the pictures that got small. This is unmistakably a decadent story. She lives surrounded by relics of her own past. Her mansion's become a museum. She's trapped inside this memory, and performance is now the reality. Identity has become theatrical. Glamour and decay are existing in the same space. Or Citizen Kane, which you've talked about previously on this podcast. It isn't really about wealth in a way. It's about the emptiness that accumulates alongside wealth. Xanadu is another museum, another archive, place full of history, full of objects, but kind of devoid of life. And he spends his life collecting things because he can't recover what's been lost. These are really decadent narratives, but transformed into a new media. And film noir as well arguably has a similar sensibility, but in a different register. That fascination with artificial lighting and mirrors and masks and deception, the femme fatale figure, urban nightscapes, all of that has antecedents in Baudelaire and Wilde and Weimar and Vienna. The visual style can feel really decadent as well. And I think Marlene Dietrich is the perfect example of this when she's working with Josef von Sternberg. She becomes, in films like The Blue Angel or Morocco or Shanghai Express, almost a moving decadent artwork herself. Everything is stylized. The lighting, the costumes, the glamour, the performance of femininity itself. She's not just a character, she's this aesthetic construction. And what's happening here, as you say, is that decadence is not the preserve of a small literary elite anymore. It's something that millions of people are consuming. So in a way, Hollywood's performing for the 20th century. It's doing for the 20th century what Paris does for the 19th century. It's taking this self-conscious artistic sensibility and turning it into a common language, a common visual language in this case.
The idea of the decline of decadence is so weird because, as you said, one of the ways in which people think about decadence and one of its symptoms is the weight of the past and the idea that the artifacts of the past and the artists of the past overshadow us. We're not capable of rising to those heights. So if you take 21st century criticism, a lot of it would say they don't make movies like Sunset Boulevard anymore. They don't make movies like Citizen Kane anymore. We are in decline. We are overshadowed by the past because we are not decadent enough, and that's one of the things that makes us decadent. So just to give an example, someone who has become known recently for writing about decadence and the idea that particularly 21st century America is a decadent society is the New York Times columnist Ross Douthat, a broadly conservative columnist, but actually very eclectic. And he's written about 21st century decadence. And for him, the symptoms of 21st century decadence in the United States are the shallowness of the culture, its repetitiveness, the idea that actually, particularly because of new technology, all of our artifacts, our pop music, our popular culture, our movies are just repetitions of things that have just gone before. You always feel like when you're watching the new thing, isn't it pretty much the same as the thing that I just saw last year, last week, 10 minutes ago? The feeling that the machines have taken over, the shallowness of our culture, harking back to a golden age. But the golden age is the golden age of decadence. God, we would kill for a bit of Weimar, a bit of Baudelaire, a bit of Norma Desmond. Even the recent musical revival of Andrew Lloyd Webber's Sunset Boulevard with Nicole Scherzinger, which I saw, it's very pared down. It's not the heavy, draped, ornamental version. It's really about the bodies. It's sort of trying almost to do cabaret. So this thing has got so confused and confusing. I don't know where I am anymore with decadence. The people who are saying that we're decadent are saying we're decadent because we're not like those decadent societies of the past. And I think with Ross Douthat, the feeling is this is a society in decline, and the symptom of its decline, American decline in the 21st century, is stagnation. It's the fact that it's just stuck. It can't express itself anymore. I almost don't know what it means. You're going to have to help me here. Have we almost reached a point, to use a very cliche term, where the idea of decadence has jumped the shark? It's almost become a parody of itself?
So one of the things that's really striking about the Nicole Scherzinger production of Sunset Boulevard, as you say, is the stripped away stage. There's nothing on stage except for an ensemble of actors who follow her around with cameras and film her for the entire time. So that's the new transformation of decadence, and it's artifice and it's surface, and it's what we do, I think, with social media. So it's different, but it's a similar structure of feeling or a structure of response, I think. And I think one thing that looking at decadence can show us is that this might feel like it's new, but it's not new. It's a transformation of a pattern that's existed before. You were talking about American exhaustion as well, stagnation. So I think what's really interesting, particularly in the American case, as far as I can understand it, is that both sides of the debate are speaking this language of decadence, but mean different things by it. So lots of the supporters of Donald Trump see America as decadent because it's become weak, or it's become over-bureaucratic, it's become concerned with symbolic politics rather than practical power. And that's a sort of recognizably Roman diagnosis. It's that luxury, refinement, elite culture is undermining the kind of virtues of society. But many of Trump's critics are also using the language of decadence. They point to oligarchic wealth, the celebrity politics, the spectacle of it, the institutional corruption, the conspiracy culture, and the idea of theatre replacing good government and an erosion of truth, and the idea, to connect strangely to Sunset Boulevard on stage, of image over substance. So it's almost a different tradition, but it connects at the same time to Baudelaire and to Sunset Boulevard in its revival.
It's interesting because you could say if both sides have diagnosed this society as decadent, well, then it must be decadent in some way. But it's also a bit like, so another term, piece of language that gets adopted by both sides in a democracy like the United States is that that democracy has either succumbed to, is on the verge of a coup, because we don't like the people in power, so they have somehow taken power illegitimately. And it could be Trump, and Trump supporters would argue that the 2020 election was a kind of coup, and Trump's opponents would argue that what Trump has done since getting into power is a kind of coup. And actually, I think in that case, it's not if both sides are saying it, there must be something to it. But actually, if both sides are saying it, it's become a completely hollow term. And it no longer picks out anything particularly meaningful. It's become too easy. You know, the other institution of American life that gets routinely described as decadent is Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is often held up as the example of decadent, and it comes from all sides in the various ways you described. It's decadent because these billionaires are leading these lives of astonishing luxury and indulgence. It's decadent because it's producing a technology of so-called progress, which is actually a technology of emptiness and repetition, and it's the shallow version of our lives. It's decadent because actually it is creating the technology that will destroy us. It's the thing that comes before the end. I'm feeling this is a bad idea. It's a great idea to talk about, but it's a bad idea because actually it's almost been hollowed out of content. I'm not sure. So when we talk about Baudelaire, I get it. I'm not sure I know where it goes anymore.
I think what's remarkable in the American case, and perhaps in other political contexts as well, is that both sides believe that they're witnessing the symptoms of the exhaustion of civilization and civilizational collapse. They disagree completely about the causes and disagree completely about the cures, but they share an underlying historical imagination. And that's where decadence can be useful. But I do take your point that if it means everything all the time anywhere, then its usefulness as a diagnostic tool is called in question. And I think that is the reason why it can be considered a bad idea, because it mistakes recognizing something for diagnosing it and doing something about it.
You could say that the Trump people, in saying America is decadent, look at Hollywood, look at popular culture, look at the universities. So from the MAGA perspective, the universities are almost the purest example of decadent institutions. And we are going to do something about it. We're going to kind of go back to some of, as you said, some of those Roman virtues. We're going to be about power and masculinity. And in their case, diagnosis does seem to go with a form of action, but you could say actually the danger there is it goes with an incredibly crass form of action. The thing that seems to be missing from our diagnosis of decadence relative to, say, the Roman case. So when Ross Douthat writes about America as a decadent society, one of the things he manages to convey is how little fun it is. I mean, it's really dour. It's kind of, we are leading these mechanized, trivialized, distracted, stressed out lives. You know, where are the people taking their clothes off? Where are the orgies? Where are the circuses? It feels like for us, if we think that this is a society that's on the brink of the end, we don't have the license to go wild. There isn't that feeling about our decadence. When people stress about climate change and the end of the world, I know there are one or two people who say, look, we're doomed anyway, so we might as well enjoy ourselves. But actually, there are surprisingly few of those people. I think if we genuinely believe what many people claim to believe, stop having children, there's no point. Stop planning for the future, there's no point. The younger people who are saying that also seem to be, I want to use a ruder word than this, bloody miserable. Where's the fun in our decadence?
I think this is actually where looking back at the longer tradition helps us to at least see what's going on, if not get beyond it. Because the question for me is not so much whether Trump is like Nero or something like that, but why it is that contemporary politics and society increasingly rewards those qualities of performance and spectacle and branding and theatricality that used to be associated with decadent modernity and have now been hollowed out. Silicon Valley, I think it's an interesting question of whether Silicon Valley is decadent or whether it's even anti-decadent, and it's sort of both at the same time. It presents itself as the civilization of the future. But if you look closely at it, a lot of its technologies, what they're doing is intensifying exactly the conditions that decadent traditions were identifying much, much earlier. It's excessive mediation, excessive self-consciousness, the replacement of direct experience by representation, and an accumulation of ever larger archives. We're thinking of beings looking backwards at everyone who came before. We now have an archive in AI of everything that was ever typed up and fed into a computer. So we've got this enormous accumulation alongside an uncertainty about originality and the transformation of identity into something that's constantly being performed. So maybe I think it's not an opposite of decadence. I think it's entering a technological phase.
These examples of decadence that we've been talking about, whether it's the Romans, I mean, it depends which kind of Roman you were. I don't think it was much fun to be a slave in the decadent era. But whether it's the Romans, whether it's Oscar Wilde, whether it's the glory days of noir in Hollywood, whether it's that version of Weimar that gets reproduced in Cabaret, one of the themes of all of this is that at least the upside of the downside of the end of things is that we can indulge ourselves. And we actually live in what is diagnosed as a decadent age, but it also feels puritanical. Young people have stopped drinking, stopped having sex. The mediation, as you say, through the absence of direct experience has produced a lot of misery. And there's the diagnosis that the symptoms of our decadence are stagnation and emptiness and hollowness. And I can't see, unless I'm missing it, the artistic flowering of the people who are enjoying living in the gap. I mean, maybe I'm missing it, maybe it's out there, but it doesn't feel like late 19th century Paris or Vienna or Oscar Wilde's London or Weimar. It just feels like in our decadence, the bit that's missing is the good bit.
But I think that's precisely the thing that we can learn from decadence, that we're very bad at seeing that. That's exactly what we don't, in every iteration, that's what we don't see, is what comes next. Rome, historians look back at Rome and imagine its end while the foundations of medieval Europe are being established at the same time. Baudelaire thinks he's witnessing exhaustion. He happens also to be inventing modern poetry at the same time. Vienna's worried about decline while psychoanalysis is actually emerging at the same time. Hollywood is lamenting the death of old worlds and this faded glamour, while it creates, undeniably, I think, the dominant mythology of 20th century culture. So maybe I think this is, for me, the lesson that decadence shows us how we're better at recognizing the feeling, as you put it, that the world is ending, rather than recognizing the birth of the other.
So one of the things that we should take from this is that I say I can't see it, but I can't see it because I am myself presumably pretty decadent. Actually, it's out there and it will reveal itself over time, the thing that comes next. A reminder that if you would like to hear our latest bonus episode to accompany this series, in which I talk to the political historian David Klemperer about the weird and wonderful world of early 20th century social credit, a fascinating history of a truly bad idea. It's available now on PPF+. To get it and all our bonus episodes, plus ad-free listening, automatic sign-up to our newsletter, click on the link in the show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com. Next time in our regular slot, something very different again on the eclectic merry-go-round that is this series. I'm talking to the writer and journalist James Marriott about the many, many things that are wrong with short-form video. Just how is TikTok destroying the world? That's next time. This has been Past, Present, Future.